Hi, everyone. We're delighted to be joined by Mr. Jonathan Granoff for today's conversation in celebration of the UN Charter. Mr. Granoff is the president of Global Security Institute, an attorney, author, and international advocate, emphasizing the legal and ethical dimensions of human development and security, with a specific focus on advancing the rule of law, international security, anti-corruption, and the threats posed by nuclear weapons. He's also the senior advisor to the Permanent Secretariat of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates and its representative to the United Nations. And these are just a few of the great works he devotes his time to. And we are honored to have Mr. Jonathan Granoff join us today. Warm welcome to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make one small correction. One of the main things that I'm involved in presently is I have the privilege of representing the International Anti-Corruption Academy as its permanent observer in the United Nations, which is part of I can participate in the General Assembly and the debates. I can't vote, but it is a full diplomatic position in the system. And the reason I'm doing it is that the United Nations is very focused now on meeting human needs with the Sustainable Development Goals, issues that weren't pertinent in 1945, protecting the climate, for example, protecting the oceans, for example, addressing pandemics, for example, and a whole set of problems that are existential to humanity, transcend any nation's capacity alone or even in a group to deal with them, and that require the principles of the United Nations system to be met. First and foremost, its most important principle, to prevent the scourge of war. So I feel that working to strengthen the ability of the UN to meet people's real human needs of today, the Sustainable Development Goals, is important to fulfill all of the things we're going to be talking about in terms of the United Nations Charter. And today, June 26th, is the day the Charter was first entered into being formally. And that's why I wanted to mention where we are today and what I'm trying to do to fulfill this extraordinary vision expressed in the UN Charter.
So in celebration of the UN Charter and the UN's objectives, can you share with us what's it like working for the United Nations?
Well, I'm not working for the United Nations. I'm working in the United Nations. The institutions that work for the United Nations would be, say, if I was in the Secretariat. But my main institutional context is the General Assembly and the organs of the United Nations, like the Economic Social Council, so forth. What it's like in some senses a dog with 193 leashes on it. Imagine a place in which much of the work that needs to be done must be done by consensus, and that one nation can hold it up. It's an institution that is absolutely necessary for the world, but it is presently insufficient to accomplish its core mission because by choice, several nations are just simply ignoring the core principles of it. So it's a very difficult time. There's a war going on in Europe, in the Ukraine. And one of the permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, is trying to annex a nation that next to it, the Ukraine, and deny the sovereignty of a nation that the entire world recognizes as a sovereign state. And one of the core principles of the creation of the United Nations is the recognition of the sovereignty of nations. So in the midst of this very difficult challenge, to address issues that require cooperation, that transcend our national identities, our religious identities, our gender identities, any identities other than our core humanity. And one wants to say, well, let's be realistic. Let's be realistic, not ideological. 60% of our oxygen comes from the phytoplankton. That depends on the health of the oceans. It's not a choice. It's not an ideology. It's not a national security interest. It's a human interest. We all are breathing the same oxygen. We have to cooperate to keep our house clean. The only institution in the world in which we might be able to protect our third lung, and I use this as an example of many things that require cooperation, is now trying to function with the burden of not being able to stop some horrible war. The very first, well, let me read a little bit from the preamble of the UN Charter, and then you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. We, the peoples of the United Nations, the peoples, you and me, not the nations, the peoples of the United Nations. It's rooted in human security, in the human being. It's very important. It's we, the peoples of the. I think it's a very beautiful concept because it affirms our common humanity implicitly in the very first line. Why? Why have we come together to create this legal instrument? To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Obviously, today we would transpose mankind to humanity. We were sensitive to. It's clear that mankind does not imply a gender. But the very first purpose is to prevent the scourge of war. And there is a war. There are several wars going on, but a war with a member of the Security Council, which has the veto power to stop any powerful actions by the UN, is very serious. Second, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. Human rights reside in the individual. They don't come from the state. They're inherent in our humanity, in the dignity and the worth of the human person, that the individual human person has value beyond market value, beyond being able to produce or consume goods and services, but based on the dignity of each person, in the equal rights of men and women and the nations large and small, equity, justice for all, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, like international humanitarian law, the laws regarding the use of force in a war, not to attack civilians, not to use disproportionate force beyond military objectives, not to terrorize, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. So I read this and I say, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and we know there are major countries in the world that don't believe that the rights of their citizens arise inherently in their being human, but that their rights come from the largesse and power of the state. In a sense, they view people's fundamental freedoms as licenses. But the fact is, they have signed this charter, and the price of hypocrisy exists. It exists in all countries and exists in all of us, you and me. I have aspirations of being fully human, and I don't feel that I've met them. But what's important is, without fundamental freedoms in a government, without the right of criticizing a government, corrections can't be made. My government, I'm from the United States, has made many mistakes. But I'm free to criticize the government. In fact, I'm encouraged to criticize the government in order to improve it. In my family, my wife is perpetually criticizing and improving me by virtue of that. So are my children. But in authoritarian regimes, where there's one political party or one person, that correction's very difficult. That's why fundamental freedoms are so important, and that's in here. And then it continues, the Charter continues. And for these ends, it stated its purposes, and in order to accomplish these ends, the presently 193 nations pledge to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all people. So this is the vision of the UN, but this vision has thus far exceeded our grasp. But without this vision, we can't move in the direction we need to move. So I say to those cynics who would say, well, we haven't achieved all of this. They have no idea how many catastrophes have been avoided by virtue of having a place and an institution in which people can talk to each other. The last weeks I've been working on a statement that will be a declaration of all the heads of state of the world relating to the 2030 agenda of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goals. So in this context, I'm able to speak with the representatives of all the world's nations, including the Russians, in a very formal, focused way of where can we find agreement to address poverty, gender inequity, environmental catastrophe. How can we work together to address these issues? There is such a place. So in the midst of these conflicts, in the midst of these problems, the UN is absolutely indispensable. And I have a lot of respect for FOPAL, the organization that you represent, because it calls for a deeper understanding of what makes us human, and is perfectly comfortable talking about love, which is so important. And you know, I often wonder why people are comfortable invoking love of their religion or love of country or love of their ethnicity and go to war and invoke love of those things. But when we say, oh no, love should be part of our working together, they call us idealists. Just like they call us idealists when we say, let's protect the oceans, let's protect the climate, let's live in peace. In the nuclear age, anything less, in my opinion, is truly mythical and unrealistic. Anything less than calling us to our higher humanity and not just the bottom line is unrealistic. And so I think that it's very important to have organizations like yours that call for the realization of the greatest gift of our humanity, which is love and living in peace with ourselves and one another.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the fundamental freedom in your household, in your family. And it's also very important that we extend that that ideal to include all humans and the whole world into one. So we can, the human rights and also all the challenges and difficulties that we're facing, we can gather more collaborative efforts to address it. And thank you for citing the UN Charter with us. It's it's a great reminder for each one of us. All right, and then with the UN Charter as fundamentals, as you said previously, that so UN, bearing so I would say like responsibilities, and also as a reflection of what's going on in the whole world, to remind the whole world of all the challenges, even though it doesn't happen within our own country, and what we're facing. You said UN Charter, United Nations really is indispensable. But would you like to add more? What
Sure.
like
Sure.
today?
Sure. I'd like to talk about there are over 500 treaties that the UN is the repository for. Much of the background that we take for granted in our daily lives depends on the structure of the UN, the treaties that are created amongst nations in the context of the UN. Let me give an example. We fly all over the world. Well, where do you live? You live in Los Angeles?
San Francisco.
San Francisco, okay. So you live in San Francisco, and you drive on the right-hand side of the road in San Francisco.
True.
As I do in New Jersey. But people in the United Kingdom drive on the left-hand side of the road. So we have different protocols for driving amongst the different nations. But we couldn't have different protocols for flying an airplane landing an airplane. So there's protocols for airports all over the world. So there's a treaty governing the protocols for landing airplanes. So even in wars, airplanes can land at airports because there's a structure that allows that to happen. Now imagine if every country in the world had different protocols for their airports, how difficult it would be simply to travel from point A to point B. There's similar protocols for trade. There's a treaty, a convention on arbitration that's included in almost every single international financial and commercial agreement. I'm wearing a suit, and this suit says it's made in one country. I haven't looked at it. It might be Malaysia, Indonesia, Canada, the United States, but the material may have come from a totally different country, the financing from another country. Just the very clothing we wear, the food that we eat comes from all over the world, with people involved in the commercial production of it from all over the world. And the energy, whether the fuel for it, could be from Azerbaijan, from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, from Canada, anywhere. We live in a completely integrated financial commercial world. Now, without the UN, if you had a commercial dispute between yourself and someone else, and there's always disputes in human interaction. That's why law is so important, because law says we're not going to resolve our disputes by killing it by force. We're going to abide by rules that we agree upon, and we'll have a third party resolve our disputes. There's a treaty called the Convention on Arbitration, negotiated through the UN. And that allows the parties in a financial or commercial transaction to determine the ways in which they will have their disputes resolved. And thus they don't rely on the rules only of the nations they're in. They can make up their own rules to resolve the disputes. And the nations of the world recognize this system. And that is what lubricates the capacity of living in an integrated financial world. People take that for granted. The internet, the rules involving outer space. There's a treaty called the Outer Space Treaty that allows us to have satellites in outer space so we can communicate, as we're doing now, right now, through the internet. There's so many parts of our daily life that needed the UN system and that depend on the UN system for their stability. And the things that are successful, it's almost like our health. When you're healthy, you forget to say, "Oh, I'm so grateful." But I thought I had hoped that the COVID recess the great mysterious power that creates life and health and everything, put us all on pause, like little kids in a kindergarten, and the teacher says, you're having a timeout. Go sit in the corner and think about what you did. A lot of people got COVID or were affected by COVID. Everybody was affected by COVID. And I hope a lot of people took time out and thought, well, maybe I should be a little bit more humble. Maybe I should be a little bit more understanding that I depend on my health can be affected by a little virus that's so small I can't even see it. And everybody I know, everybody everywhere can be affected by this virus that doesn't recognize borders. So maybe my health depends on the public health of the whole planet. Because if there's any place where the virus is thriving, it will mutate, and because it's smart, and come back and get the rest of us somewhere else. So we're all in this together. And the UN is a place that affirms that. And where there's corruption, bribery, tax avoidance, tax evasion, arising especially from illicit activities, human trafficking, gun running, drug running, etc., that affects everybody everywhere. So when there's virtue anywhere, that also affects everybody everywhere. Now that applies not only to nations, but that applies to each of us as individuals as well. When we are corrupted in our thinking and excessively selfish and lacking in caring for one another, our own well-being is compromised. It's corrupted. And when we exemplify those principles, they have a rippling effect in families, communities, and nations, and the world. So this is what I think. This is not the UN. I think that the wise from my studies, the wise from time immemorial, have stated that we must treat all others as we wish to be treated, and that to see the human family as one. Ancient scriptures in so many traditions of the wise say the human family is one, and we should respect all. Well, that's always been a moral, an ethical ideal of the wisest amongst us. Never before has this become a practical necessity. Modern science and technology have forced us to come to the conclusion that we must treat other nations and other peoples with the dignity and respect that we want for ourselves. And when nations don't do that, suffering for the nation that violates it, and suffering especially for those whose fundamental rights and freedoms are violated, increases. But when those principles are adhered to and followed, what happens is justice prevails, peace prevails, and human flourishing prevails. And the UN Charter, in calling on creating an enabling environment for the entirety of humanity to do this, is such an incredible step forward in human progress. But it comes from the humbling horrors of World War I and World War II. The very first General Assembly resolution calls for the abolition of what we understand to be nuclear weapons, calls for the abolition, the termination of this venture of creating weapons that can destroy us all. That should be taught in every single school. The other very important instrument that arises from the Charter, created by many of the same people who created the Charter, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Maybe even a more exalted instrument, certainly more exalted in its philosophy and ideals. It doesn't present a structure for its application the way that the UN Charter creates an institutional structure for the application of the principles: a General Assembly, an Economic Social Council, a trusteeship council to free many nations from colonialism, a security council where the power of the use of force resides. It creates a structure to apply the principles. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is largely an expression of values and what we as a species, as a human community, recognize to be basic to our humanity. And it is an extraordinary document because it says that our dignity and rights and values are inherent in being human. They don't come from the state. It reminds us that we're born with these rights. That's a very powerful idea that should curtail and constrain the most powerful to respect the dignity of the weak and care for the least amongst us. Today, at least a third of our human family doesn't have sufficiently potable, clean water. At least 1 billion people live in unnecessarily burdensome poverty. We're not only the first time in human history that we can destroy ourselves, we're also the first time in which we have the wherewithal to eliminate the suffering of poverty. We have spent, as a human community, over $25 trillion in military expenditures since the year 2000. If a small portion of that was dedicated to human security, to taking care of people's wants and needs, the world would be a so much more secure place. But we're spending this money because we've forgotten. We've forgotten these principles as first and foremost. We've forgotten them because of fear and greed and our frailties as humans. But that doesn't mean that we should marginalize the institution or the principles. On the contrary, it means that we have to, on this day, recognizing the Charter, reinvigorate our commitment to the cooperation that is implicit in its expression.
Definitely. That's why, of all other many things, among all other things that we, makes it even more important that we recognize and celebrate the UN Charter today. And then now for our viewers, I think it's an honor to mention that Jonathan was invited by Full Power to ring the bell of war, peace, and love on September 27th, 2019, where you rang the bell and made the wish, be sincere, be real, be true, be human. As you made the wish for peace, how do you think we as world citizens can achieve this together? And or do you have any stories that you can share with our viewers that demonstrate the ways we can create peace in our lives?
We never thought the Cold War would end without a bloodbath. We never thought apartheid would end without a bloodbath. But there were people who stepped forward, not just the leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan who helped end the Cold War. Not just Nelson Mandela and Willem de Klerk who risked their lives and helped end apartheid, but thousands of people whose names and efforts will not be recognized by society, but will be recognized by God and recognized by the peace of their consciences. You and I could be those people. That's what matters. Now, I have had the privilege of engaging with the summits of the Nobel Peace Laureates, the group, I represent this group at the United Nations, 15 summits of these extraordinary people who were recognized by an organization. Every one of them emphasizes every time that they worked with many, many other people whose reputations will never be famous. None of us know what good comes from the good that we do. All of us can experience the burden of the things that we do in which we haven't followed our conscience. All of us can recognize the mistakes that we've made, and all of us can dedicate the good that we do to the source of good that lives within us. So I would say, love people and use things. Never love things and use people. Things are to be used. States, institutions are to be used to serve people. Why? Why are people so important? Because human beings only survive in the web of life, and only human beings can destroy the web of life. Human beings are capable of having the wisdom to know the source of their own existence, to know it, not just to follow it. Other creatures all follow it. The trees, the birds, the bees, the insects, the dogs, the cats, the reptiles, they all follow the Creator's plan. They don't have a choice. We do. We're gifted with this gift that we can also know ourselves and create ways of showing love, compassion, patience, peacefulness, justice. And when we don't, there's no creature more dangerous than the human being. So the question you ask is beyond my ability to give an answer. It's beyond my ability to say that there's some formula. The UN Charter has portions in it that if we were to live by, it would make a big difference. Chapter 5, Article 26 calls on the military staff committees coming together to reduce military armaments. That would be a good step. Maybe. I think so. They haven't done it. There's many things that appear that could be done. We should immediately get rid of nuclear weapons. We should immediately set aside a way of classifying these existential threats that are new, that didn't exist in 1945, and have an agreement that we will affirmatively deal with these identify and deal with these existential threats differently than everything else. We have to. But those are beyond the reach of most of us. And we have to have politicians and diplomats who engage in them. And those are the outcome that people of good heart who realize the sanctity of all human beings come to similar conclusions about application. That's one of the things I've seen. So the key is to find that love of people in your heart, because only human beings have the capacity of knowing the mystery of the Creator. And each human being is therefore precious. Many forget it, and out of fear and greed and selfishness, create suffering for themselves and others. But we don't have to do that. And we should understand that the ideas that we have are things. The institutions we create are things. They're things. They come and they go. But the soul of every human being doesn't come and go. It is immortal, and therefore it is sacred. So as you go deeper into yourself, you'll realize what are the things, like ourselves in some way are things, because we will terminate at some point physically, but our souls won't. I can talk this way because I know your organization is focused on the spiritual dimension of our humanity. It's grounded in that. It's a vision of the human being as sacred, as capable of honoring the Creator by our actions. But when we love things, our institutions that we create as ends in themselves, we do great harm. So I say, love people, use things. That is a doorway of learning how to love the Creator, to love God. We should never love the things that we create and use people. And the institutions that are based on fundamental freedoms of the human being, the inherent human rights in people, they lead to institutions that are beneficial, to treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that calls for negotiating the elimination of nuclear weapons, like the International Criminal Court that says that the conduct of heads of state and conduct of anybody that violates international criminal law should be prosecuted, should be stopped. But I think that those tools and those institutions are in terrible need of strengthening. I look at the public discourse and I'm appalled at what I call the pornography of the trivial. And by that I mean blowing things out of proportion as if they were very important and diminishing the importance of things that are really important. So the way people express their sexual preferences, whether you agree with it or not, it is not as important as working together to protect the climate of the planet, working together to get rid of nuclear weapons. It may be important, but not at the same level. And if you follow the political discourses now, my goodness, how much time is spent on things that don't matter very much, and how little is spent on things that matter very much. So I think people need to get informed about the issues that affect all of us and ask questions of our political representatives and our leaders. And that goes for people in leadership positions in many institutions at every level, because the world is so integrated. What are you doing to protect the climate? What are you doing to protect the environment? We need to ask ourselves in our schools and our institutions, our religious institutions, what are you doing to eliminate corruption, selfishness, greed? What are you doing to eliminate corruption? What are you doing to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons? What are you doing to get rid of these? And then what are you doing to get rid of poverty? If you ask these questions, if our political leaders were to spend time answering those questions, their time would be far better spent than so many of the things that they are debating all around the world. And I think if we ask ourselves those questions and one other question, what am I doing to find the God's love within me, and what am I doing to bring it into action in my daily life? What am I doing to cultivate forgiveness? What am I doing to advance justice? What am I doing to make the world a little bit better? What am I doing? Those questions we all have to ask. That's the best, but I don't know of any simple answer to your question. There isn't any. It's such a big question. It's such a big question. I gave a very big answer, but it comes down to this moment for each of us. And it comes down to engaging and making sure that our political leadership expresses these values, especially in a time of war. We should never demonize those who violated the laws to perpetrate a war, because at some point we have got to come together. At some point we have to stop, the war has to stop, and at some point we have to, World War I, the losers were punished terribly. Reparations were burdened on the German people. What happened? We had the chaos of Nazism in World War II. World War II, UN Charter was created, and my country, proudly, victorious, fighting for freedom, instituted the Marshall Plan and built the economies of the enemies of Japan and Germany. The consequence being trading partners and democracy in those countries and thriving, which has led to thriving in much of Asia because of Japan's example of the value of freedom, commerce, democracy. And it led to creating the European Union, a union in which there's tremendous wealth and freedom, creativity, and stability. So when people say, oh, these ideals are so unrealistic, I just say, then you haven't studied history very well.
And they probably haven't seen far enough. They don't have this insight. I mean, maybe we don't see the immediate results, like tomorrow or next week, but in the long run, it's good for the greater good.
In the long run and the short run, what is good is actually the most practical. What is immoral, unjust, violent is not good in the short run and the long run. As Mahatma Gandhi said, the only way to peace is through peace.
Well noted and well said. And finally, what is your message of love and peace to the world? You mentioned you said so many phrases that I could quote, but the final message of love and peace to the world, please.
Don't ever win an argument with your conscience. Make sure your conscience wins every argument that it poses to you.
What a beautiful message, Jonathan. Once again, thank you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts with us. We hope our viewers feel inspired to take actions. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for your time. I'll see you hopefully soon.
Thank you very much. Thank Dr. Wang for convening us, and for the entire spiritual family that you're part of, that calls for the unity of the entire human family, that doesn't say everybody has to join your group, but that says everybody should join the group of being human. That's a wonderful thing. I don't want to live in a world where everybody agrees with me. I don't want to go to a restaurant where they only have one dish. I want to live where there is multiculturalism and variety. That's just much more. That's just much richer. You know, if God wanted to make us all the same, that's what we would be. But we're not. So why are we here differently? So we could appreciate each other. And I know that that's the spirit of your organization, and that spirit makes me glad to participate with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Okay, we'll see you next time.